module is co-funded by Erasmus+. It aims to stimulate the development of research and teaching in European Union studies in Armenia. And it is a core component, the central component of our new double degree master program in human rights and security, which we're implementing jointly with the Tusha University. It is one, at this stage, one of two double degree programs. We also have another one, the new innovative program in circular economy, also implemented jointly with Tusha University. And more are on the way, so please follow our updates, because not only degree programs, but non-degree specialized training programs are in the process of development, and they will be offered to Armenian academic and professional communities. After the 2 working days of Summer Institute, the Jean Monnet module is organizing a following up session for students, advanced PA, MA, and PhD students. And the objective of this following up session is to reflect on the presentations, on what we discussed during the workshops, but also to express the vision of young generation on the problems that are currently topical issues both in Armenia and globally. And we, of course, invite you to join this session as well. It will be a rather informal conversation, and to all the students who will be participating, the certificate of achievement will be awarded with 1 ECTS credit. So please join us, and also invite your peers, your mates, to join the second day if they're not available today, but maybe the second day of the Summer Institute, and then the following up session. We are really welcoming you, and we are waiting for your participation. Thank you very much for coming, and I wish everybody a very fruitful experience of mutual exchange of opinions during this event. Thank you very much.
For your words. So I would just announce our colleague from University of Nevada, Dr. Nerses Kopalyan, and afterwards our colleague from Stonehill College, Massachusetts, Dr. Ohanyan. Please enlighten us with your words on opening of this institute.
Thank you, everybody. I'll express my appreciation to Eurasian Country University. This is a very important 2-day session that's been organized. Although that's been done by the public 2 honors, Armenia honor and Boston honor, right? But you know, when we talk about organizing seminars and conferences and workshops in Armenia, generally there's a very serious need for that. And I think this 2-day event that's been organized fills a very, very important gap. And that is to enhance general understanding of both region and security dynamics. And of course, with this comes broader issues of humanitarian concerns, international legal concerns that are part of the broader platform that we'll be covering in the 2 days of workshops and panels here. But when we talk about the important issues that the region faces, and more specifically the important issues that Armenia faces, we all understand that security remains a fundamental problem. Yet we see a deficiency in the field of security studies, whether it's in the academia, whether it's in the research institutes that we have, or in the nascent and growing think tank industry that's developed in Armenia. And one of the things that I'm hopeful about is events such as these that are designed and organized by those who do understand security and have written and published a lot of work on security that contribute to nurturing level of scholarship, research, and understanding within the realm of regional and international security that can contribute to both learning as well as scholarship in Armenia. So I want to express my gratitude for the organizers of this event, specifically not simply as an act in academic exercise, but also filling a very important void in Armenian Armenian society and specifically within the realm of Armenian learning and academic growth. Thank you.
Greetings to you at this institution as well as to followers who are over Zoom. We do hope to have your active participation, and we're going to create as many opportunities of engagement as possible. But again, I want you to join Nerses and Parsa and Anna, and thanking you all for coming, the sponsors of this really important, I think, an important conference. What I would like to do to say a few words as to continue as to what Nerses started, to say a few words as to why we chose this topic and why we structured it the way we did. I think when we think of geopolitics, and I'm representing the field of study, political science, that does have a very heavy emphasis on geopolitics, broadly defined, is very kind of looming over our heads and leaving us with very little agency of controlling it. So this conference is really designed for us to understand how these big geopolitical currents are shifting and shaping the continent of Eurasia, Eurasian geopolitical stability. But more importantly, we're going to try to do it from different levels of analysis. But we'll try, we have a panel at 5 o'clock with scholars from the United States who will join us over Zoom. We'll talk about some of these bigger, broader themes, but we also want to emphasize that geopolitics, big and large, is also becoming increasingly grassroots, is increasingly penetrating into our political system, meaning that as individuals, as citizens, as states, as regions, we do have significant agency in affecting, in shaping some of those currents. But before we'll be able to do that, obviously, we do need to understand those currents. I also would like to highlight that this conference is very specific and being offering an academic, scholarly space for us to engage in these conversations. Scholarship, the debate, the public discourse on the Russian invasion in Ukraine can be very emotional. Obviously, it's a war. It should be emotional. At the same time, it could be quite polarizing. There's a lot of analysts, scholars in West, in Armenia, there'll be more quote unquote pro-Russia, more pro-Ukraine. We're trying to really transcend that bifurcation, to try to understand the war as a phenomenon, number one. We are not, let me clarify, we're not going to probably try to get to the causes of this war. We're much more focused on the consequences of this war for geopolitical changes that are happening in this continent, of which South Caucasus is a big important component. The second day of the conference is focused on international law, human rights law, and judicial reform, specifically with the question as to whether or not there is room for international law at the times of great power turbulence. On the surface, it might be tempting to think that law is probably weakened since the world politics is becoming militarized, new imperial. But at the same time, if you think back, and this is not my area of expertise, we have scholars I'm seeing in the audience who are specializing in this, and we have speakers, experts who will talk about this tomorrow. But if you think back as to how the international law was formed, those were always formed at the time of great turbulence. So I do remain hopeful that if we do understand the geopolitical currents and understanding how to navigate that, I do remain convinced that international law is an important tool in navigating, in producing a more peaceful, more rights-based, more transparent, more rules-based world, while essentially going through this turbulence in world politics. We do have a panel that will focus specifically on international law. That, I think, starts around 2 p.m. But we also will have Yerusha Kiragosyan, Sosi Tatikian, who replaced Irina Aflanyan on the panel, and Anna Korostyankina, our own, who will join the panel. And then at, I think, 4:30, we have a panel focused on judicial transitions. We have a colleague of mine from Stonehill College who will join in to speak about judicial transitions after democratic breakthroughs. And his approach will be
more focused on the post-Soviet world, not just one country. Every country that is experiencing a democratic breakthrough has to grapple with judicial transitions. Complicated, but needs to be understood. And then we'll also have speakers who will focus on specifically on Armenia. Our own Nerses Kopalyan will join that panel as well, in addition to a speaker from the Open Society Institute. And I will conclude by clarifying that we have two workshops. One is led by Dr. Kopalyan today, focused on scenario planning. That's 1 hour. It will be held in a different classroom to maintain a little bit more interactivity. And I will lead another workshop tomorrow titled How Do Regions Pacify Between Neo-Imperialism and Multipolarity. And I do confess that this will be the first time that we'll start drawing from my forthcoming book that will be published. Actually, early copies are already out, titled The Neighborhood Effect, the Imperial Roots of Regional Fracture in Eurasia, that is out with Stanford University Press. So with that, I suggest that we get going. I mean, this is a really fully packed agenda, and we are going to have more speakers that will be joining in over Zoom. This conference has been promoted worldwide, so with the time difference, I expect to have more speakers joining over Zoom. So with this, I will stop, and maybe Nerses and I hit the ball running.
All right, so to show people like to not lose the time, I would really thank. I'm really grateful on behalf of the Summer Institute and Eurasian International University towards our very good colleagues and partners from the United States of America. The foundation of National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, NASR, and right now we will be presenting you with a pre-recorded video introduction of NASR from Mr. Mark Mamikonian. So please I would like to ask your attention on our co-sponsor of this Summer Institute presentation, a pre-recorded presentation.
This is not a personal dream. It is a dream that has been shared by many of us. This fervent hope that in America we can create a center of research, learning, and training in things Armenian.
It's a
just do it. Stop sharing. Stop sharing. Just
Actually, my apologies because we ran to technical problem. So I think we can start our Summer Institute. First of all, let me thank you again for everyone for your time, for being here with us. And because this is very important for us to have the Summer Institute being held at the Eurasian International University as a very active member of higher education institution of Yerevan and in general Republic of Armenia. in terms of supporting and being advanced in human rights studies and international relations, internationalization strategies. So please, I would just announce plenary session part 1 on topic of geopolitical turbulence and South Caucasus. So it will be lasting for 1 hour from 2 o'clock until 3 o'clock. We will have our panelists, Dr. Nerses Kopalyan from University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and Dr. Ohanyan, Stonehill College, Massachusetts, and Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Washington, D.C. So thank you, everyone. Dear panelists, respected panelists, you have the floor. You will be heard by our Zoom audiences and also present.
Okay, I've decided to use notes so I can constrain myself so I don't go into tangents. And my coffee has not kicked in yet, so I apologize in advance. So the way we'll structure the next hour or so, and we do have a little bit of a wiggle room if we have to go a little more. So I'll try to finish in about 10-15 minutes, then Dr. Kopalyan will follow. Then we'll have questions, we'll get questions from you as well as from the audience members. So what I tried to do actually, in preparing my notes today, I thought about framing the conversation as we get ready for our 5 o'clock panel on geopolitical turbulence. We'll have this Russian scholars from the United States that have been looking at Russia in the context of the Eurasian continent from different angles. But my approach to this question is somewhat different. I do look at the Russia-Ukraine war in terms of its impact on the Eurasian stability as a continent. And in that respect, I'll get to it a little bit later on, but let me just kind of start with thought-provoking questions. Some of the public discourse that I've been following so far, again, tends to look at the Russian invasion in Ukraine as a turning point, while others look at this as a culmination of events that have already been unfolding. So is the Russia-Ukraine war a turning point in Eurasian strategic competition and Eurasian security? Is it a watershed event for Russia's increasingly contested political peripheries in Central Asia, the South Caucasus, to Eastern Europe? Is the Russia-Ukraine war a symptom or a cause for the emerging new, albeit limited Cold War? If we're moving towards a new Cold War, then who are the actors? Will the developing countries, the emerging states, quote unquote, be joining? Or they're also known as the fence sitters, because a large number of countries are not willing to be pulled into another confrontation because of the high level of cost that such competition can create for such states, mid and small states. Is the Russia-Ukraine war a symptom or a cause for the breakdown of the Cold War, cold peace that was established in Europe? Now, the first argument is the Rapture argument, meaning that the war is a watershed moment and it is a turning point. What is used to justify that argument? It is argued that despite decades-long deterioration of relations between Moscow and Washington, the war resulted in a complete rupture between the two poles. The Russia-Ukraine war is viewed as a culmination of that competition. The sanction regimes on Russia amount to economic containment geared towards excising Russia out of the global economy. So in this respect, this is viewed as a rupture, different than from what has come before. Russia's war built and erupted as qualitatively different from its other military operations in Georgia, as well as in Ukraine, as well as relative to its Crimea operation in the Donbas republics. The war erupted as a war of conquest. And as such, again, this signals a rupture, difference from what has come before. The war has fueled global mobilization against Moscow. Much of the world is a stakeholder of territorial integrity norm, and the Russian invasion sent jitters, particularly in the post-Soviet world, as well as in broader Eurasia. This was a blow to the norm of territorial integrity. The war also signaled openly imperial foreign policies, and it's not just Russia that is practicing or justifying its actions in imperial terms. Neighboring Turkey is also behaving somewhat similar way, as well as China. And there's a new book out by Jeff Menkoff, Eurasian Empires, that actually focuses specifically on Russia, China, and Iran, I believe, as new imperial states that are practicing new imperial policies. Now, this particular discourse that views the Russia-Ukraine war as a rapture also argues that this war is an attack on the rules-based world order. The continuities argument, same old, same old. The war is a symptom, not a cause. The post-Cold War order in Europe was always fragile, the argument goes. Russia was left out from the European security order. It was too big, too dysfunctional, too authoritarian, too nuclear, too autonomous strategically, historically too distinct, in rather seeking a great power status rather than membership in a broader community in Europe. Because it was so too big, too nuclear, too historically different, it was argued Russia was never integrated into the broader European security order. That was the argument. That is the argument. Actually, this is quite effectively advanced by Richard Stockwell. As early as in 2000, the Cold War essentially gave to cold peace. The war in Ukraine is a culmination of the failure to build a European security order within this perspective. As early as in 2000, Gorbachev lamented, apparently the West is incapable of dealing in a reasonable way with the results of the new thinking that freed the world from bloc politics and total confrontation. The wider Europe emerged as a quintessential fractured region, split between Euro-Atlanticism and Eurasian pools, the latter with Russia-China engagement in the continent. The new Cold War was already in the making. The war heightened the cleavage, the Ukraine war heightened the cleavage between the West on the one hand and Russia with some China coordination on the other, albeit China actually quite diligently follows the sanction regimes applied by the West. Domestic drivers of Russia's foreign policy have been in the making for quite some time. Domestic factors in Russia that also contributed to the choice of the Kremlin of this war. Deepening authoritarianism in states in general centralizes political power, making militarization an easy-reach solution in dealing with foreign policy challenges. And this war has reaffirmed Russia's historic pattern of perpetual geopolitics. This argument is developed by a historian, Princeton historian Stephen Kotkin, and I really find his scholarship on this fascinating. His argument on Russia's perpetual geopolitics states that Russia historically has always engaged in big geopolitical engagements, military operations, at times to compensate for the shortages of domestic reform, for the need for domestic reform, and that this pattern of geopolitical competition, geopolitical engagement outside, despite quite modest economic basis at home, is a pattern that he argues is repeating and can be used as an argument to explain Russia war as a continuity, Russia's war as a continuity, not a rapture. The West, Euro-Atlantic regional groupings have never altered their bloc politics, as highlighted by Gorbachev earlier, as I mentioned. NATO and EU were used as regional security blocs, which radiated security in concentric circles, emanating from inside out, inside core Europe out. Security and democratization were viewed as something to be exported into the small states, mid-sized powers in the Eurasian continent. So this is also a continuity argument. And importantly, as I have argued in my scholarship for years now, the Western regional groupings came at the expense of building regional security orders around Russia's peripheries. Both Russia and the West have practiced regional fracturing in various forms. Western policy towards Russia swung back again deeply into rapture. The quality of relations between the West and Russia has not changed, but opportunities to regionalize Western Russia, West Russia policy is here. So I'm curious to engage you on this question. as to whether the war in Ukraine can thus create political opportunities for building greater regional connectivity in Russia's peripheries as a way to containing Russia, to managing Russia in the context of Eurasian geopolitical stability. The argument I'm making is that regions are open, so this is not a new Cold War, and that the path to geopolitical stability in Eurasia will start from the regions, Russia's political peripheries. Now, in terms of going back to the argument that there was no security order, inclusive security order made between Europe, narrowly defined, and Russia. Many, Sakwa in particular, have argued that this was the death of Europe after the end of the Cold War. It kind of sounds like a radical argument, but the argument that I want to engage is whether after the war in Ukraine, whether we're going to witness the death of Eurasian integration. Up to that war, I do think that, especially with China's rise, the Belt and Road Initiative, Russia-China alliance, there was a very clear path for Eurasian integration, greater connectivity of the continent. One scholar, Calder of Johns Hopkins University, actually referred to the continent as a supercontinent because of its enormous potential of economic and political, provided that the continent would be able to solve its connectivity issues. So it is in this context that I'm asking actually rather whether we're seeing the death of Eurasia or whether there are opportunities of maintaining and advancing Eurasian connectivity from the smaller peripheral regions. So the policy puzzle that I'm advancing here is largely a top-down look to the regions, and I will look at region buildings tomorrow during the workshop. So what are the scenarios for greater regional resiliency in Russia's peripheries after the war? And are there trajectories where the rapture of Eurasian connectivity can further fracture and corrode Russia's political peripheries, Central Asia, the South Caucasus, and Eastern Europe? Now, the Eurasian continent represents the promise and the perils of our global future. It has long been considered central to world economy and geopolitics, dating back to Mackinder's writings on geopolitics, geostrategy. The continent is now vied with hope and trepidation. It has dominated global political history for centuries. It drove exploration to the New World and the Industrial Revolution. It also has been the site of the rise and fall of multiple empires over the past millennia. Importantly, the continent was the heart of the physical infrastructure and social networks that drove slavery and exploitation beyond its shores. And it is as its networks emanate from Eurasia that pushed the statehood as a political unit, as a political and bureaucratic unit around the world. So statehood was globalized as a bureaucratic structure. At the same time, the continent remained rife with dangerous divisions and persistent fault lines. If unchecked, could sap its potential global political power moving forward. Connectivity for infrastructure and institutions will determine whether the supercontinent can overcome its vulnerabilities to realize its economic and political potential. Now, managing the Eurasian turbulence and fostering connectivity will start in the regions, is the argument I'm making. Actually, China is engaged deeply in regional politics. There are two paths to a rise of China that are identified by scholars and China analysts. China's path to global hegemony, one of which is regional, establishing regional dominance in its neighborhood to project global power, or global dominance to influence its neighborhoods. All politics seems to be regional, as the great power polarities heightened. Yet, if viewed as Russia-West confrontation, the nature of the Western approach, particularly the US's approach, is showing only few signs of transformation. Specifically, and I'm citing Sakwa, the Western EU, that their commitment to their neighborhood has remained deeply Atlanticist. The absence of a continental vision means that when these norms encountered a resistant other, in this case Russia, the norms themselves became geopolitical, even if their intent was benign and transformative. This is a quote from Sakwa. This is the essence of the structural argument about the breakdown in relation between Russia and the Atlantic community. Meaning that even if the European Union has emanated as a normative, bureaucratic, technocratic, very benign project with all kinds of developmental potential and promise, it did become geopoliticized because it remained a narrow Atlanticist and it did not have a continental integrative component, is the core of this quote. I have argued in a paper published in the Washington Quarterly early this year that US's Russia policy has always oscillated between containment, principled pragmatism, selective engagement. The US policy has always been Kremlin-centric. The US's Russia policy has been too Russian, I've argued. The Kremlin bias betrays a lack of Eurasian policy in Washington, which traditionally has engaged with this continent through complex systems of security alliances and bilateral economic relations. Indeed, implicit in these approaches is the primacy of the bilateral US relationship with Moscow over alternative of a more direct engagement with the post-Soviet regions on Russia's peripheries. Since the Cold War, this fixation on Moscow has overburdened the US-Russia relationship as the axiom that all roads to Eurasian stability converge on the Kremlin, meaning that if you find a bargain with the Kremlin, peace will spill over, trickle down to the rest of the continent, to the rest of the region, and we all will live happily ever after. So, needless to say, I challenge that position. This inclination reflects a combination of Cold War inertia, avoidance of the unfamiliar, the ebb and flow of US interest in post-Soviet states. I'm probably a little bit over it, Nerses. Not a little bit, a lot. I'm going to cut, I promise. Now, regionalized US's policy towards Russia in the long term should be a strategic choice for the West. Strategic region building or support for regional resiliency is a key pathway forward in rewiring relations between the West and Russia. Many scholars have argued that geopoliticized approaches favoring security policy and strategic orientations among post-Soviet states, often at the expense of democratic institutional development in recipient countries, have diluted the systemic impact of US assistance in the post-Soviet states, often empowering illiberal regimes. And we can look at South Caucasus, US's policies of strategic and energy policy diplomacy, as they're called, with Azerbaijan, or the same types of policies with Central Asia. Bilateral and state-centric approaches to democracy promotion did little to capitalize on regional opportunities. This would entail cultivating regionally embedded social networks to create regional capacities and support systems to defend democratic institutions from ground up, as opposed to from top down, which is also important, also needed. I'm going to skip over a little. Now, here's a question. I argue there is an opportunity to regionalize the West-Russia policy, building up stability from the region. To put it simply though, can Russia live with resilient regions, hypothetically, in its periphery? In my prior scholarship, I have argued that Russia does practice regional fracture to project global power. So why would Russia be interested in regional connectivity in the peripheries now? And I'm going to skip a little. 3 quick arguments, and I'll stop here. Enhanced regional connectivity can elevate Russia's strategic value for China. It can stabilize Russia's neighborhoods, opening new pathways such as trade and transportation corridors for Russia. China's strategic preference for greater connectivity in the Eurasian continent puts pressure on the Kremlin to support such objectives, especially now that Russia has become in many ways a liability, not just for Russia, but for some of its other partners. Second, social mobilization in post-communist states has taught the Kremlin to accept the path of least resistance and learn to live with people power as a new factor on the ground. This is more likely after a much weaker Russia is emerging from the war in Ukraine. Russia's policies are colorblind. Western discourse, for example, is divided. Russia does not like color revolutions. It's going to push back, hit back on color revolutions when they break out. We've been discussing this in my Russia class that I'm teaching at American University of Armenia with my wonderful top-notch students currently being in the audience. Quick hello. So what we argue that historically or looking in a contemporary way, there's also scholarship saying that Russia actually, the Kremlin does not like street protests, that's yes, but at the same time, Russia has a historic coexistence of all types of political systems in its neighborhoods. That's number one. And number two, Russia has demonstrated that unless a state in its neighborhood does not do a geopolitical jump, Russia knows how to coexist with political systems that are different than its own. This is why I argue that Russia is colorblind. And the war in Ukraine is less about democracy versus authoritarianism than about the invincibility of state sovereignty as a cornerstone of the rules-based world order, which again, Kremlin justified its intervention, President Putin in particular in imperial terms. So this was really a U-turn even for him in the way he justified it. So in this respect, even Armenia's Velvet Revolution is now in the global media, is starting to be appreciated and analyzed, that Armenia's democratic credentials are much stronger as a Russian ally, are much stronger than those of many European states, meaning that this war is a game about sovereignty, not so much about democracy versus authority. I'm slowly concluding, and I'll get to the rest in the Q&A, to say that if you look at, again, China's Belt and Road Initiative goes through all kinds of authoritarian neighborhoods. As I mentioned before, openness, regional connectivity is not something that is palatable, that is something that autocrats look for. Because what tends to happen, and I'm looking at my text, looking for specific statistics, but what I do argue that regionalism can be in the self-interest of such illiberal regimes. Regionally wired economic networks can serve as safety valves, relieving internal pressures on ruling cliques. Regionalization can advance liberalization and threaten the vested interest of the patrimonial states, those in Central Asia or Azerbaijan. At the same time, even autocrats need to produce economic growth. The protest activity is on the rise worldwide, with 78% in authoritarian-leaning states, right? Even China's Belt and Road Initiative started to deepen continentalism and connectivity in Eurasia, passing through these illiberal neighbors before around Russia. Again, this is before the Ukraine war. Maybe we can discuss as to what does the very challenging war in Ukraine, that is Ukraine is waging, that is Ukraine is defending itself, can open openings in providing stability in the broader Eurasia, and whether some of that can spill over into the Eastern Europe, where Ukraine is trying to defend itself against this war of conquest and invasion. Thank you. I'll stop here. I'll pass this forward to Nerses.
Thank you, Anna. I mostly agree with your assessments. We usually see eye to eye. That's why we write together. But I want to take a slightly different perspective on understanding the developments of Ukraine and Russia, and specifically framing it within broader global structural development, and then to see how this is going to affect Armenia and regional configurations. So, for the longest time, when you study power relations between countries and the field of polarity and superpowers, Russia is defined as a revisionist actor. Okay, what do we mean by that? What this means is that Russia has been consistently attempting to revise the US-dominated international system. Okay, so we qualify the international system as being bipolar, where there's a single hegemon, there's a single superpower that runs the world, that dominates the world. Russia is the only country in the world that acts as a revisionist, meaning it is the only country that has attempted to challenge the US-led unipolar system. Many, for example, look at China and they assume that China is challenging the United States. China is not. China plays by the rules of the international system. China abides by the system, and China has economically grown by simply conforming to this system. So Russia's continuous challenge to Eurasian unipolarity and the broader post-Cold War system that we've seen is an important indicator in trying to understand why things have developed the way they have developed in Ukraine, and why we have seen such a high level of Western orchestration, organization, and a collective will to counter Russia's behavior. So these dynamics are quite fundamental. One thing that I would like to point out is I do not view Russia as a whole. Russia is a great regional actor, but Russia is a very weak international actor. In that context, I primarily qualify Russia as a middle power as opposed to being a great power, because Russia does not function at a certain capacity outside of its region. So Russia acts as a hegemon regionally, but internationally, it is not any way close to being a hegemon. Whether we look at quantified metrics of state power, of state capability, this simply isn't the case. So when we see these conversations about a pending Cold War, while conceptually makes sense, the important factor to look at is, does Russia actually have the capability to engage in a Cold War? Does it have the resources and the capacity to act at the global level in countering and challenging the so-called Western established system, which is heavily dominated by the United States and its NATO allies? In this context, Russia's capacity at the global level is quite limited. And this became very prevalent in Ukraine. Most analysts, including in the United States and the West, assume that Russia's invasion or pending invasion of Ukraine will last a matter of days or at most weeks. The assumption was Russia is in essence a global military power and it has the capabilities to absorb Ukraine in a very short period. This proved to be false. This also demonstrated that Russia is not the political, military, and economic power that it has projected itself to be. And so the assumption here that we may be entering a new stage of great power rivalry, I do not see it. And primarily due to the fact that Russia's power capacity, its power parity, has mostly been exaggerated. Now, what does this mean going forward? Usually, a country that is the size of Russia, when they are cornered, they tend to be a lot more dangerous. And so when we speak of states engaging in rational behavior, this rationality is very limited when certain states with certain power capacities are pushed into a corner. This is why it's very important to pay attention with the way the Western powers and the unification towards Russia is designed or sustained. And the broader assumption is that, yes, they want to see Russia weakened. Yes, they want to see Russia defeating Ukraine, but they do not want to see a Russia that's collapsing. And so stable Russia remains in the interest of all Western actors. So there's a very interesting balance between taming Russia's behavior, but also at the same time not leading to the complete collapse of Russia as a regional power. Because as Anna spoke about fracturing and a lot of what I've done in hegemonic behavior, when you have regional powers in a very quick and swift fashion declining in power capacities, that leads to a lot of conflict, regional war, and breakdown in the regional order. So Russia's presence is still needed at the regional level, but Russia's behavior at the international level needs to be controlled as far as the West is concerned. This is how I primarily qualify the developments in Ukraine and how the West has very quickly mobilized against Russia. This is basically an attempt to control a revisionist power, but at the same time to sustain some level of regional order. Now, what are the implications of this for Armenia and for the region? As I noted, while Russia has proven itself to be very limited in the international field, in the international realm, Russia does remain the most powerful actor in the region. It is the singular regional hegemon. There has been talks of Turkey becoming a rising regional power or interjecting itself into regional developments. And yes, Turkey in essence is a middle power. If Turkey had the nuclear capabilities that Russia had, we would be having a different conversation. And so what really distinguishes the power parity between the two states is Russia's nuclear capability. But as far as domestic developments are concerned, in Armenia and the region, the Russian dynamic is still very, very relevant, right? And so there needs to be an honest question posed. What are going to be the consequences for Armenia in the region with a declining Russia? Because we know that after the Ukrainian conflict, regardless of how the conflict is resolved, Russia is going to come out of this conflict much weaker. Okay, not a weak regional actor, but at the global level. He went in as a strong actor, relatively speaking. Now with the depletion of resources, Western sanctions, so on and so forth, Russia is going to be relatively weaker. Okay, what are going to be the implications of that? Three things to consider. Russian regional policy, security policy, is primarily defined in sustaining frozen conflicts. This is a fundamental part of Russian policy. We see this in Moldova. We have two situations in Georgia, and we've had the issue of Artsakh and Nagorno-Karabakh for the longest time in the South Caucasus. And so sustaining frozen conflicts offers Russia a certain security architecture, which allows for relatively less resource allocation, but maximum regional pressure. And this is the same thing we're very likely going to see in Ukraine. Russia very likely is going to institute some kind of a continuous frozen conflict in the Donbass region in the east to continue destabilizing Ukraine, but at the same time allowing itself to have some effect with respect to Ukraine's growth and development. So as far as our lens is concerned in Armenia and in the region, the first assessment, as I said, of frozen conflicts is becoming the new status quo in the Nagorno-Karabakh issue. We have seen discussions of concerns as far as from the Azerbaijani side, what's going to happen with the Russian peacekeepers. We've seen concerns in domestic politics in Armenia or in the diaspora, where we have talks about status of Artsakh, and there have been general concerns of where the negotiations are going. And I can pretty much confirm, based on my research and my findings, that the negotiations are really not going to go anywhere for a long time. Not because there is no political will in Armenia, not because you don't have sufficient negotiating partners, because the frozen conflict logic that defines Russia's broader security architecture makes it conducive to status quo preservation. And what we're going to see into a very long period is some form of a status quo being developed in Nagorno-Karabakh with a very strong Russian presence. All other developments are basically going to be side effects of this. So this is the one factor. The second is specific to understanding alliance relations with Russia. Russia operates not as an ally, but as a regional power with satellite states around it. So Russia does not treat its allies in the way other actors treat their allies. So for example, we observe US-NATO relations, US relations with its allies in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America. Two factors define these forms of alliances: reciprocity and mutual adjustment of interests. This is how these alliances are formed. Even though there's a large power parity, right? Even if we look at the relationship between Turkey and Azerbaijan, there's some level of reciprocity and mutual alignment of interests. Armenia's alliance with Russia isn't shaped this way. There's very little reciprocity, and there's uniform, a one-sided adjustment of interest. Armenia adjusts to Russian interests. And so from the lens of alliance building, the relationships tend to be one-sided. Why is this relevant? Because it creates issues of longevity, and it also creates issues of reliability. In this context, whereas, for example, Europeans can expect the United States to behave a certain way if something happens, or Azerbaijan can expect Turkey to behave a certain way if something happens, Armenia cannot have those same expectations. So when much of Armenian society was surprised during the 40-day war or after, why isn't Russia acting in a way that we expected it to act? Or why isn't Russia utilizing the resources that we think it has and it could do so? The answer is very clear. If it's not in Russia's interest, they're not going to act that way. So their state interest supersedes alliance interests. And this is a very important thing to consider. And this is another development that we're going to see further becoming more rigid after the Ukraine conflict and how Russia comes out of this. And the third component that I want to discuss, and Anna has touched about this, is issues of regional integration. When we talk about regional integration, when we talk about regional institutions, these aren't new. For example, the CIS has been around since the end of the Soviet Union, and the CSTO as a security architecture has been around since then. And then there was a Eurasian Economic Union that was formed as some counterweight to the European Union's economic influence in the Caucasus and the post-Soviet cities, and so on and so forth. All of which just demonstrates that whether it's the CIS structure, the CSTO structure, or the Eurasian Economic Union structure, these are utterly underperforming structures. Let's just use that word. Okay, why? Because it's an accepted norm that these structures are developed to specifically advance Russian interests. Now, within that process, of course, some of the interests of the given actors involved do play a role. But overarchingly, these are not regional integrative structures. These are regional structures designed to be dominated by Russia. And of course, none of this is a criticism. Okay, all these are objective assessments. And in order to understand regional development, we really need to understand how Russia operates and functions, and more specifically, what the consequences are going to be for Armenia after the weakening of Russia with the Ukraine conflict. So the notion that you have a partner that you can rely on certain strategic issues, yes. But the assumption that you have an ally that you can rely on, this over-reliance is really, really misleading. So these are important configurations to consider. But to kind of quickly wrap up on my conversation here, the interconnection between broader global developments, the regional developments, and specific developments that are important to Armenia, we need to understand the multi-level units of analysis as Anna initially mentioned. So third level imagery, this unit of analysis looks at the international system. We need to understand this as a relation between a revisionist actor and the existing global system that is trying to contain that revisionist actor. Within the regional structure, we will see Russia attempting to reinstate its regional influence and to reestablish itself as a regional hegemon, especially after it comes out weaker from the Ukraine conflict. At the domestic level, Armenia should expect more engagement from Russia, but at the same time, you need to understand that the alignment of interests are going to be out of balance, and this is a continuous reality that it needs to calibrate when it develops its policies. So those were basically my general assessments. Thank you.
Are there questions? And now if we go to the audience, or we could go to the Zoom. I think I see there are 2 questions on the Zoom already. As my mentor would say, not all at once. So no questions yet?
No questions, but I can get the question. No, there
From
are no
the
questions.
Zoom. Yeah. There are no questions or 2? Okay, very good. There are no questions on the Zoom?
He's right there.
Okay, very good. Oh, okay, what you're asking. Oh, okay, very good.
So meantime, we can do the question.
Very good. Absolutely.
Can I speak from here?
Absolutely, yeah.
Hi.
If you could speak up, and I will.
Yeah, sure. My name is Emilio Kropko. I'm visiting university here as part of the Erasmus program. I'm not an expert of Ukraine-Russia conflict. I was in Ukraine. I'm more on the Balkan Peninsula issues. And I was wondering, according to what you said, is there any difference, in your opinion, between the specific state and role that Ukraine has as part of the Russian periphery and any other country that is there? So is there a Ukrainian specificity there? Because as far as I understand, Ukraine and Russia, they do share some specific moments in history, our culture, and one is sort of like accusing the other to be like the healing part of it, the identity. So we can say a few words about that.
Sure. That's a great question, and it's one that I actually did not include, did not cover. And I'm glad that you actually asking that question. For our audience over the Zoom, I'll simply restate the question. The question is as to whether there's something specific about Ukraine as a Russian periphery that adds a specific dynamic to the Russian behavior. So there are different ways of thinking about this. Historically, obviously, there has been Ukraine as well as Belarus currently. Much of the post-Soviet world that was also part of the Russian periphery did have a contentious relationship. There were with Russia. There were periods when when Russia tried to Russify its neighborhoods. There are periods when it pulled back. Like this is sort of there's a vast historiographical scholarship on this. But what does matter in the context of this particular geopolitical rivalry between Russia and the West is that the Kremlin, in its discourse, has for a while, I think, argued that it's NATO expansion that is a problem for Russia. So NATO expansion was viewed as problematic in the Russia-Georgia War of 2008, and then now Russia-Ukraine relations are largely somewhat explained by the NATO expansion. There's vast literature substantiating that argument. The argument being, even though Ukraine and Georgia were not likely to join NATO before the war, because Russia already built conflicts in the two states, even though they're specific, in the case of Georgia, there was a specific, very real ethnic minority, there's a real ethnic conflict there, but less so in Ukraine. But still, both countries had political armed conflict in their territories, which essentially is as close as you get as a guarantee to prevent their entry to Russia. So that to NATO. So this kind of leaves the argument then why is the Kremlin using the NATO rhetoric to justify? You could, to give the Kremlin the benefit of the doubt, you could argue, well, okay, even though Ukraine is not joining NATO anytime soon, but NATO and EU have been kind of working in lockstep. Maybe it's the Euro-Atlanticism that is aggravating Russia. You can make an argument that Russia does view threatened by that expansion, a position that actually precedes Putin. This is not just a Putin argument. At the same time, though, I think, and actually I've given interviews to Bloomberg, I've published just the night before going and making a NATO argument, kind of seeing the possibility of it. But because Russia's invasion was a war of conquest, right? He could have approached this differently. He could have pulled off, Putin could have pulled off another Crimea scenario, another Donetsk scenario. But because this is a war of conquest, because this was justified in a very deeply imperial speech, this kind of raises the question that this is not about NATO primarily. There's something else is going on. As I mentioned in my opening comments, to also add, Ukraine also does have a strategic positioning in terms of its Black Sea ports, being this frontier nation between Russia and the West. But at the same time, I'm not particularly convinced that as a frontier status, that was the reason, because every country you take around Russia could be a frontier state, but it's the historical claims that the way that Putin justified it, I think, resonated with this. So, and I think I keep coming back to Putin's argument, Putin's imperial speech, because it really was a breaking point. It was a rapture, in a way, to how Russia up to that point had been justifying its behavior in world politics, largely arguing, just saying that Russia wants to be one of the players in the multipolar world, kind of pointing the finger to US, saying you're being unipolar, you're being unilateral, right? So there has to be multipolar equality, et cetera, no matter what the intentions are. But with that speech, essentially, Putin is saying that's a very disturbing speech, because he's essentially making an imperial argument which flies in the face of the international law, international human rights, the norms of non-intervention, the norms of non-use of force. These are all important norms that stabilize the world all around the world. They establish small states get security from the strengthening of the norms against conquest, right? So in that respect, I think it's, to a certain extent, Ukraine is unique for its positioning, for its historical relationships. but at the same time, there's also domestic factors that were driving Russia's decision, claiming Putin's path to war. That also needs to be considered. I'm going to put Professor Horostankina on the spot and to say she's the chair of the law department, but she's originally from Ukraine. So I think if she wants to add anything or agree, disagree, feel free to do that, Anna. I would love to hear your perspective. So I hope that answers your question. Thanks for bringing it up. We didn't cover it at all. Very good. Any other questions? I think Elisa Durian has a question. No questions? Okay, Parsa.
In general, do you have any perspective over the perspectives over the Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia? Do you think that it will end anyhow anytime soon with a less destructive way? I mean, like, because
Negotiated settlement, you mean?
we witnessed Iraq, we witnessed Afghanistan, we witnessed Syria. So is there any perspective that you have that could a resolution that would end this war, so we could really avoid the destructions that we had in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria?
Do you want to take that question? I'm happy to add later on, or I can answer, and if you want to. Let me start and pass it over to Nerses. Parsa, that's a great question because there is a lot of research on specifically post-war periods. I've been looking at post-war Nagorno-Karabakh after 2020. In general, these post-war periods are very unique because they're windows of opportunity. Either in this post-war period, conflict parties prepare for the next war, or they use the opportunity to move towards settlement. So I like your comparison of the envisioning and thinking as to how, number one, what are the scenarios of ending the armed conflict. And Nerses, I do agree with Nerses, there might be a permanent instability built in with this, but how does it compare to post-war Afghanistan, to post-war Iraq? I think Iraq and Afghanistan, they were horrible by many accounts, and I do agree with those assessments, difficult decisions, no very popular decisions in the United States, US intervention in Afghanistan after 9/11, and then Iraq, which is much less justifiable, but there were not territorial conquests. In that respect, this is very different. But still, in the United States poured billions of dollars in both countries, which created domestic backlash against their presidents. But even the most recently US exit from Afghanistan was heavily criticized. The point highlighting that these types of interventions, in the case of United States, designed as a sort of artificial top-down state building modernization efforts, have a very limited capacity in providing the stability needs. I think Iraq, I would argue, has stabilized by and large. And there is a lot that now Iraq can do in locking in the stability and deepening the very fragile democratic institutions that are there. In the case of Afghanistan, it's very different and very difficult because the United States came into the society that was deeply tribal. It tried to modernize from top down, and the Taliban actually realized that society is deeply tribal, and which is one of the reasons that they co-opted the tribal structures, and which is one of the reasons as to why the state that the United States has built collapsed so quickly, right? Very, very quickly. So as to what is possible, I think the ending in Ukraine might look somewhat different. I think Ukraine, in my assessment, is going to enter a period of hybridity. I do think, Nerses, I'd be surprised if Russia, although it kind of takes the Donetsk republics as a sort of the frozen conflict area. I think the Kremlin will try to kind of annex and Marseille to internalize, to digest that territorial claim. The West will not recognize it. But Russia always has been stuck between territorial versus institutional levers. It's in territorial power because it struggles in building institutions to maintain, to project power. So even if it digests tries to digest this territorial bite out of Ukraine, it will still maintain an active political cleavage in Ukraine. But I think Ukraine will enter a period of hybridity. With the Western support, you'll be able to rebuild and also learning to live with that conflict, somewhat similar to Georgia as well as Abkhazia and Ossetia. But Ukraine is also different because of its positioning, its access to the port, its centrality to food security worldwide. So in that respect, the world might galvanize a little bit longer in protecting, in kind of producing stability in Ukraine. As I'm saying this, we should keep in mind that the attention, the world's attention, especially in democratic countries, attention span is very, very limited. So cultivating the Western support for Ukraine has to remain constant diplomatic activity for Kiev. Nerses, if you want to jump in on this.
Two very quick informative comments. So in the cases of Afghanistan, for example, Iraq, these were very different because there was nobody to negotiate with. The United States invaded, occupied, absorbed the government, so we had no negotiation structures. The post-war period was defined by a single dominant actor. If Russia would have succeeded in invading and absorbing Ukraine, we would be having the same conversation. But that wasn't the case. So you are seeing some form of a negotiating structure, even though it collapsed, being the only way going forward. So these are two very different post-war situations. But fundamentally, kind of quickly touch upon what Anna said, even if Russia ends up annexing the Donbass, it's still a frozen conflict because Ukraine and the West aren't going to accept it. So as long as you have internecine hybrid conflict taking place, that's the frozen nature of the phenomenon. But generally speaking, when we look at post-conflict societies, generally there are two equal actors that are negotiating. In the case of US invasions, this was never the case. There was a singular victory and a failed occupation and then subsequent outcomes. As far as, for example, the 40-40 war we had, we do have two states that are actually negotiating. And what we're going to see with Ukraine is something relatively similar once they're able to sit down at the same table. But I'm not sure the post-war literature might work as well with trying to allow us to explain and understand what's going to happen with Russia and Ukraine, because right now you have really two maximalist positions and there's really no room for negotiations. Also, whereas as Anna brought this up, Ukraine views this as sort of a territorial survival, kind of a form of war. Russia views it very, very differently. From the Russian lens, it's a broader global conflict. And so there are also important ideological components. Now, it might not be a very popular statement in certain circles, but I do want to make the point that Russia does have certain legitimate concerns. It doesn't justify the invasion or the behavior. But when we talk about trying to understand why Russia behaves the way it did, we have to note the fact that after September 11 happened in New York, with the Twin Towers, and the US invasion of Afghanistan, Russia was extremely instrumental and helpful as a partner in the global war on terror. So Russia did attempt to work with the US, did attempt to work with the West in this period. And of course, the Western response, especially the American response, was one of indifference. And they basically told the Russians, you're not an equal partner, you have to sit at the table. This had some effect on Russian behavior. And of course, subsequently, with the discussions of Georgia eventually joining NATO with the whole Bucharest Declaration and so on and so forth, that completely had a paradigm shift in Russian foreign policy and foreign behavior. So these shifts did not happen in a vacuum. And these slowly crystallized into this whole perspective that from the Russian lens, either the West absorbs us or we have to push back. And this basically became, in a very simplified lens, the broader doctrine that shaped Russian policy. And as Russia became more militarily powerful, the objective was to maintain this revisionist behavior. And so we cannot be blind to what happened 18, 19, 20 years ago that led to a shift in Russian behavior. And I think certain actors in the West, specifically the Bush administration, was instrumental in pushing Russia away, as opposed to perhaps absorbing them in and doing a better job of integrating Russia into the international structure. There are consequences to foreign policy developments by powerful actors, and we cannot deny that in trying to observe future behaviors. And so there are all these sort of interconnected causal factors to take into consideration.
Yes, there's another, perfect, can you read? Yeah. Go ahead. The lady, yeah. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Implications of these war sanctions and energy security will cause internal instability in European countries, and they will have to accept from their approach to this Ukrainian, the exit to the Ukraine. What could European states, Western states, America, European countries keep this war and support Ukraine in the center of the concern of the side? What will happen if they do it?
Let me take a crack at it, and then Nerses can maybe jump in on it. That's a very important question. I think also provided, considering the impact of the COVID, worldwide protest activity is high. I mentioned this in my opening comment. So regardless of this war, I think countries are in this period of domestic turbulence. You have the rise of right-wing parties, etc. But specifically, I think the growing food prices, which is going to be a reality, many parts of Africa, there are worries that famine will hit. So these are very real concerns. In the case of the United States, and I answered not as a specialist American politics, but as someone who kind of lives there, right? So I think there is going to the increase in the oil prices definitely is going to have an electoral impact. President Biden is now actually went hat in hand with Saudi Arabia, trying to lower the price of oil. And we had one of our speakers at 5 o'clock panel, Mark Katz, just published an article in Responsible Statecraft on the impact of this war, Russia-Iran relationship that is fascinating. So we'll hear more about that. But I think there will be electoral shifts. There will be, I think politicians might pay a price, but it is not going to have a systemic effect on this state, because the United States in particular is going through all kinds of challenges to democratic institutions. I do agree they'll be difficult to maintain sustained attention on Ukraine. When the United States was everything from Afghanistan, that's all what you could see in the news. And then slowly, no one is talking about Afghanistan. My daughter, Elisa Dorian, would always say, nobody's talking about the war in Yemen. So I think democratic politics do have a short attention span, but they're going to sort this out electorally. But it's also quite possible that regardless as to who comes after Biden, if his policy sustains and carries over, and we'll see what Congress actually positions itself, I think there might be some continuity. It can go either way. But I think the fact that this is a war of conquest, that it is so anti-systemic, even while China is benefiting, India is benefiting from taking up the resources, Russian resources for very low prices, they're also random, which complicates China's plans, because China does not like to meddle into countries' affairs. It likes to be very hands-off in its approach to kind of trying to be the engine of connectivity, and China would have been much more effective if Russia was not such a liability for China. That's my assessment. So I think we might see effects domestically, but systemically, these are states with pretty strong institutions. And kind of one politician losing and the other gaining, yeah, so what, right? There will be an impact. You're also asking whether this will create change in policy. It can go either way. It really can go either way. I think if it was not a war of conquest, if it was similar to Crimea or Georgia scenario, I think it would be much harder to sustain the tension, as opposed to the way in which this is moving, and the West is arming Ukraine. And then we also should keep in mind as to what's going to happen to Russia domestically. That's also an uncharted territory. because there the social contract is eroding. So that's also, we're really, I would argue we're in uncharted territories on both ends, which is why we need to study how the shifts are going to impact some of the peripheries that are not in the direct line of fire. That's true, yes, but because authoritarian states in general, and Russia specifically, because they're authoritarian, there's a certain level of stability that they can enjoy, but they're also vulnerable because they don't have information. When within authoritarian states, when you don't have any mechanisms to register discontent, to understand discontent, that means you're short on information. And as we see in the case of, well, I don't want to compare apples and oranges, the Middle East, I mean, when the Arab Spring erupted, it came in a way. These are also very similarly resource-rich societies, deeply authoritarian, with very few feedback mechanisms. But those semi-authoritarian, authoritarian systems are much more stable because they allow some level of discontent to happen, right? So while authoritarian states might seem stable, once it's a house of cards. Once it happens, it's fine. But again, Russia is very different. It's rich in resources. It has a very conservative political culture. My students and I talk about this quite deeply. So yeah, I think Russia is to a certain extent a different and outlier, but also similar typical authoritarian state, meaning that it is vulnerable in all kinds of ways. Nerses, do you want to jump in on this?
I just want to comment on the question regarding U.S. policy. A lot of policy plays speaking in Washington, D.C. Basically, it's in America's strategic interest to continue this war. Let's have no illusions about that. We're talking about Russia, the United States, and possibly some of the West wanting to relatively weaken Russia. This is precisely how you weaken Russia. And so what we are seeing right now is a situation that allows the United States in a very resource-easy way to fund or give arms to a country that has a relatively large army and they're willing to fight the Russians. Now, the outcome of this is what? Continued depletion of Russian resources, high casualty rates, and it also allows the United States and the West to justify the sanctions on Russia. So this is a situation where you have a regional hegemon having found itself in a situation that it could take the one revisionist actor and reduce him to a much weaker level. So the United States has no incentive at this point to even allow the Ukrainians, and I mean, I'm saying that on purpose, to allow the Ukrainians to sit down and negotiate. It's simply in America's interest to continue this. And it's sort of, when we talk about the Vietnamization of Ukraine, or very similar to the Russian Soviets had in Afghanistan, there's a very, very similar thing, a situation we're going to have a war of attrition that's going to lead to massive resource depletion for Russia. But as far as the West is concerned, the resources are going to allow them to continuously think on and fund the Ukrainians. Last week, NATO had a conference, G7 had a conference, they openly said, we're going to support Ukraine until the end. This is just another way of saying that whenever that end is, right, Russia's going to be the one that's going to basically have to deal with the material depletion because Ukraine has no problems with endless resources for them. I think this is very, very indicative of that. And from the Russian lens, they clearly, we speak about domestic political culture, that is a political culture in society where saving face is very, very important. They simply cannot back out and concede defeat. And so I think the United States has Russia to some extent in a vice. And to keep basically straightening the screws to the extent that it needs to in weakening them. But the prolonging of the conflict is definitely going to be a lot worse for Russia and even for Ukraine. But from the Western lens, again, we're talking about morality, ethicality, removal, in the lens of hard politics, this is very much in America's strategic interests.
I'm going to go for a second. I want to give advantage to those who have an asked questions. And I'm going to, I promise I'm going to get to you. Yeah.
From Eurasian University, social professor. My question relates to reciprocity alliance Armenia between Russia. It's really one-sided. Armenia
Speak up.
yeah. It's like Armenia is a hot state for Russia. And you said in your speech that one side, only Russian state interests are first, then the rest. So what is the way out for Armenia? As I see, beginning in Ukraine, we saw more appearance of Russia in this region, especially for Armenia, this is relevant. What is the way out for Armenia? Partners who would be both aligned and reciprocity would come up.
Very good question. Two factors here. The fact that Russia has an alliance relationship that it has with Armenia, and the fact that it's not very favorable towards us, is not only Russia's fault. Armenia has 30 years of failed policy towards Russia, and it's been very one-sided. We basically told the Russians, help us, help us, help us, give us, give us, give us, but we never provided anything in return. So this dependency, this sort of freeloading that Armenia created the 30 years of failed diplomacy and policy is one of the reasons. So Russia has never had an incentive to create a mutually aligned form of relations, because Armenia is basically, told Russia, just give us what we need and everything else will concede to. And I'm simplifying it, of course. So that there's been a failure in developing a strategic vision in Russian relations. The other factor, of course, if we talk to Russian policymakers, they're going to pose the question, Armenia never has sat down and spoken with us on how we can develop mutual interests. So Armenia's position has been provide us security and everything else will concede. And so because the relationship has been so securitized, all the other factors that are very, very important in developing and enhancing relations have been really, really underdeveloped. Even when we talk about institutional processes, right? How did Armenia join the Eurasian Economic Union? Well, Armenia negotiated for 5 years to join the EU, and overnight it switched. It was based on power politics and pressure. Those are not healthy institutional ways of developing allied relations. So we've had this discussion at the Opry forum last time with other Russian academics present. There needs to be an honest discussion of what the expectations are and how do we move forward, right? I've always posed this question. For example, Armenia needs to understand what are its obligations with the CSTO and why is it a member and what can the CSTO do for a member state, okay? Because if you're part of an institution with rules and regulations and you apply for those rules and regulations and you get ignored, that's a fundamental problem, right? So there needs to be a recalibration of what the interests are between the two states moving forward. But we never had these discussions because, as I noted, the policies were very, very based on dependency. But again, if, for example, the CSTO works the way it's supposed to on paper, that could be very beneficial for Armenia. If the Eurasian Economic Union is able to expand or incorporate other regional actors, excluding Azerbaijan because they're a spoiler actor, these factors could also enhance. We have to have a recalibration of interest and discussion. This has never really happened. Also, I need to be honest about this. Russia has never taken Armenia seriously as a partner. For 30 years, it's viewed Armenia as sort of this very incompetent, underdeveloped, spoiled child that only asks for weapons. Again, I'm being very anecdotal about this, but this is an honest issue, right? And so if you have an ally who doesn't act like an ally and acts like a dependent child, that also shifts your perspective and vision. And so, we saw a very big shift in Russian policy, after about 2003, 2004. The more powerful Russia got militarily, the more its relationship probably shifted. And the more dependent Armenia became on Russia, the less Russia viewed Armenia as an equal partner and ally, and more as a dependent satellite. And so we need to recalibrate and make a transition from being the satellite to a partner country. And that is a conversation that are kind of taking place right now. We have to wait for the Ukraine conflict to end until we've had that conversation.
Russia is a big military state. So, in my opinion, maybe you will not agree. I think that Armenia has some specific multi-vector governance policy. No?
From Armenia's lens.
Armenia succeeded in its multi-vector governance policy somewhat.
Okay, so,
You can't just blame them.
no, exactly, we need to blame ourselves first, right, for having such about policies. So for the last 20 years, Anya spoke about a complementary but balanced policy. Yeah, the problem with that is you need to have the resource and abilities to balance before you can start talking about balance. We never balanced, we didn't know how to balance, right? So we never really get at that. What I'm talking about is not a question of blame. What I'm talking about is developing a relationship where the interests are aligned. Because you're too weak, you're too small to balance anything. But if there are honest discussion about alignment of interests, where Armenia tells Russia, for example, X, Y, and Z are very crucial for us. If you can meet these demands, then we will all reciprocate that by meeting your demands of X, Y, and Z, and maybe a little more because there's a power disparity. We've never had these honest discussions. In the last 20, 25 years, it's mostly been the Kremlin calls Yerevan, and Yerevan says, okay, what do you want me to do? That's not a functional relationship. That's not a balanced relationship. And a lot of times, there is no coherent policy of how relationships are developed. So there's nothing, you can't talk about blame or this or that. Those are very primitive conversations. But in essence, if you go to any Russian policymaker and ask them, what is Armenia's policy towards you? They'll scratch their heads. They wouldn't even know. You don't really have a coherent Russia policy. Okay, and so these are the conversations that we're having. We have very underdeveloped institutions when it comes to policy development, and that's the byproduct of what we're seeing in the relations with Russia. So both questions are very, very consistent, and sort of, we're assuming we thought we had policies with Russia. We had something developed. In reality, it was always ad hoc, interpersonal, non-institutionalized, and those are not sustainable ways of developing strong relations or partner alliances.
I'm going to take the knowledge back. Nerses, I'm going to be a devil's advocate. Because I never thought about it. I really agree with whatever you're saying. Totally agree. But at the same time, when we say that Armenia did not give anything, first of all, Armenia-Russia relations as asymmetric, it's not the first asymmetric relationship in the world. So meaning that it's useful to look at similar other cases. How is that asymmetry managed in other cases? So tomorrow I will talk about this a little bit during my workshop, how regions pacify, focusing on the small states literature. Very quickly, one way for Armenia to balance this asymmetry is to embed its relationship with Russia. First of all, I'm not calling for rupturing relations with Russia, recalibrating, renegotiating, absolutely, I agree with Nerses. But I think as a small state, Armenia does need to embed that asymmetric relationship into a broader nesting of institutions, building regional institutions around that dyadic relationship in order to somehow to limit the types of pressure that Russia has been putting on Armenia. And I think while formally Armenia probably lacked a policy relative to Russia, but I think Armenia paid dearly for its alliance with Russia and Nerses. And specifically, I think if you look at corruption as a strategic choice, by aligning with Russia, Armenia's state, I don't want to blame everything on Russia. As Armenian citizens, myself included, we should take ownership of how and why our political history moved to certain in a particular direction. But at the same time, I think recognizing that in the 21st century, states practice sharp power, influence operations, using corruption, tying in corruption networks from Armenian economy to the Russian economy. Those really have enormous institutional costs for Armenian statehood. So that is not to say that, for example, the United States has done a lot of damage to its allies, right? US-Chile relationship is just notorious, right? And several other countries in Central America. So I think when you look at that from the small states literature, small states have to be vigilant that great power rivalry is going to affect them. That's number one. Number two, you have to, as a small state, you have to guard your institutions of statehood, because that is the most important engine with which you are going to manage this geopolitical rivalries, including this asymmetry with Russia, right? Having said that, yes, I think Armenia paid dearly for Russia's strict relationship with Russia. But at the same time, I think Russia also subsidized, whether it's energy, what have you. But then you can also find analysis that Armenia is stuck with this energy contracts with Russia, while it could have bought oil and gas from Iran at a much less prices. And I think Armenia-Iran relationship is very underutilized, right? And largely because Russia just will not allow it. So I think the way Russia, I fully agree with Nerses that Russia-Armenia relationship is not much of an alliance, partly because Russia is an imperial power, a hegemonic power. And as hegemonic powers, when they move to a region, they're not satisfied with just getting one state. They need a broader base. Russia has already moved out of Azerbaijan, all the peacekeepers are back. So technically, de jure, now Azerbaijan again has Russian troops on its territory, de jure. If you say that, Nagorno-Karabakh de jure is part of Azerbaijan, right? But at the same time, it does not have bases in Georgia, but again, it has control of Abkhazia and Ossetia. So I think every great power, regional power, when they try to protect power, they're going to try to have as many bases as possible. And I think while Turkey goes around screaming from the top of its lungs, I'm an imperial, new imperial, Ottoman Empire is back, it's actually Russia that has been practicing imperial policies by trying to maintain its peripheries, right? And if you look at Turkey-Azerbaijan relationship, Turkey-Armenia negotiation processes, and Turkey essentially stuck to Azerbaijan's needs, which limits Turkey's presence in South Caucasus, right? Then you're saying Turkey's policy actually is not imperial, it's short-sighted. We can talk about as to why that is, but essentially Turkey is doing Azerbaijan's bidding, which is not always good for Turkey. But Russia does whatever it says good for Russia, right? So that's how I read it. But I do think that Armenia paid dearly for its benefited and lost in some respects. Yeah, Parsa, I promise, I'm sorry. And thanks for being so nice and letting everybody else go first.
So, I mean, I would keep it for the next session because, if I started, it would be longer.
That's okay. What's the question? I can remember to pass it on to the panel at 5 o'clock.
Yes. So the thing is, for me, as Russia, it never been a colonial power. I mean, in fact, they never had this development of colonies. God and Soviet Union had some aspects of it. But do you think that Russia as an unexperienced power, like a colonial system, is acting actually more as you mentioned that they try to have bases as many as possible, so they don't know how to do it. They deal with it a different way. They create more a buffer zone. How do you see it? It's very interesting because other countries like Iran, maybe United States of America or some other countries, they try to, go inside with some any other ways, get some their bases there and be there for the next couple of decades. But Russia is always trying to create a buffer zone. Why do you think that they are always acting in this way? Why they have in their mentality, in their system, to create a buffer zone, but not to control the government of that resource?
Yeah, great question. I think in general, Russia also prefers to have permanent bases, if it could. But it really shows as to how far the world system has advanced, that these big powers cannot really do whatever they want, right? So that's very important for the perspective of the small state. But in terms of, so I agree that Russia likes to create buffer zones, and historically that has been the case. Part of the reason has to be because Russia is so large, it never had clear boundaries. So it always actually talk about this in my book that has just been out, specifically on that point, because Russia, by creating, Russia always had a choice. How do you provide the security of your state? You either advance territorially, right? You control South Caucasus to protect the North Caucasus. You try to advance. The more you capture, that becomes yours. Then you need more territorial conquest in order to protect the inner. Or you can strengthen your institutions domestically and generate security internally, which was never Russia's strong suit, right? So I think that's my read as to why Russia likes to have buffer zones around it. Alex Foley, actually, we'll ask that question to Alex Foley because he actually looks at those issues. Thank you very much for this really thoughtful questions and participation. So we would like to invite you to coffee outside and snacks outside. After that, we'll have a workshop with Dr. Kopalyan on scenario planning and foreign policy. After that, we'll take a break, and then 5 o'clock, we'll hear from the 3 scholars from Columbia University, George Mason University, and Nerses University. Yeah, very good. Thank you so much. I'll see you over there. Bye-bye.